What could cause a modern jetliner to lose complete control only seconds after takeoff? Bank angle, the warning system blares. For me, this case was unusual, one of those stories that's both frustrating and maddening. Let's break it down. In well-managed airlines, safety oversight runs through every layer of operations. Government inspectors monitor maintenance work and sometimes even sit inside cockpits to observe. Safety departments collect anonymous reports, analyze patterns, and pilots themselves feed into that system. But what happens when an airline operates in an environment where this kind of supervision is minimal or, in some cases, practically none? That picture starts to look a lot like Saurya Airlines in Nepal. This small regional carrier launched in 2014 with just one Bombardier Courage 200. At first, it offered short flights linking Kathmandu with Bodrapur and Biratnagar in the southeast. Expansion was on the roadmap, but those plans collapsed when the airline couldn't keep its existing flights running reliably. Then in 2016, Nepal introduced a law requiring airlines to have at least 2 aircraft to operate scheduled flights. Since Saurya only had one, it was pushed into offering charter flights only. A year later, after scraping together enough money to add 2 more CRJs, the company resumed scheduled services. But financial struggles kept resurfacing. In mid-2018, the airline halted flights altogether. One of its 3 CRJs was placed in long-term storage, where it remains even now. Operations restarted briefly, then collapsed again in November that year. Another restart happened in March 2019, only to be shut down later due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Flights didn't resume until October 2020. Through all of this, Saurya barely managed to survive. Executives even talked about expanding with ATR turboprops after the pandemic, but nothing came of it, likely because funding was uncertain from the start. Now you might be wondering, how did an airline with such a shaky history manage to hold on to its operating certificate? The reality is that in Nepal, Saurya wasn't unique. The entire aviation sector there faces serious challenges. Nepal is consistently ranked among the riskiest countries to fly in, with crashes occurring almost every year. Geography plays a big role. Towering Himalayan terrain, sudden weather changes, and difficult airports all add to the danger. But the problems don't stop with nature. A bigger issue lies with weak regulatory oversight. Nepal is listed as one of the world's least developed countries, which means resources for government enforcement are scarce. Yet, because air travel is critical for tourism and connecting remote regions, Nepal's aviation sector is far more active than in most countries with similar economies. This mismatch, heavy aviation demand but underfunded oversight, has created systemic safety concerns, and the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal (CAAN) hasn't helped matters. Unlike most countries where regulators are placed under transport ministries, CAAN is housed under the Ministry of Culture and Tourism. That's a conflict of interest, because the authority not only regulates the airlines, but also owns and profits from the very infrastructure it is supposed to police. Reports of corruption and close ties between CAAN officials and the tourism industry only add to the concern. Even the International Civil Aviation Organization, ICAO, has called for Nepal to split the CAAN into separate entities, one focused on regulation and the other on infrastructure management. So far, that separation of duties in Nepal's aviation authority still hasn't happened. Because of this ongoing lack of effective oversight, every airline registered in Nepal has been banned from flying into Europe by the European Aviation Safety Agency. That blacklist has been in place for years, and an ICAO audit in 2023 confirmed the situation is actually getting worse, not better. That's the environment Saurya Airlines was operating in when this incident unfolded. Before getting into the accident itself, let's pause for a moment to emphasize why oversight matters so much. Without checks and balances, any system, whether it's aviation, business, or even our personal online live scan, become risky. At the center of this story is one of Saurya's CRJ-200s, registration 9AN. The jet was built in 2003, making it just over 2 decades old when its airworthiness certificate came up for renewal in March 2024. Routine renewal inspections were carried out on time, but the aircraft's main landing gear was due for a scheduled overhaul. For reasons that aren't fully clear, that overhaul wasn't completed on time. Instead, the airline applied for and was granted an extension, which allowed the plane to continue flying until June 19, 2024. When that deadline passed and the work still wasn't finished, the jet was grounded on June 21st. It sat idle for more than a month before engineers finally removed, serviced, and reinstalled the landing gear on July 22nd. By then, however, another major inspection was due, a C check, which is a thorough maintenance review carried out every 20 to 24 months. The facility that handled C checks for Saurya was located in Pokhara, Nepal's second-largest city. But the aircraft was parked at Tribhuvan International Airport in Kathmandu. To move it, the airline applied to the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal for a one-time ferry permit. The request was approved, on the condition that the aircraft passed a basic return-to-service inspection first. That check was completed successfully on the morning of July 24th, with approval granted. The ferry flight was scheduled later that same day so the aircraft could immediately begin its C-check in Pokhara and, ideally, return to service soon after. Now, it's important to understand how a ferry flight differs from other non-passenger flights. A positioning flight is used to move an aircraft so it can operate a regular passenger or charter service from another airport. A ferry flight, on the other hand, is specifically for moving an aircraft to storage or a maintenance facility. Unlike positioning flights, ferry flights can be conducted with certain mechanical issues still unresolved as long as they are within approved limitations. For example, a ferry flight might take place with one engine inoperative or with an unpressurized cabin. Both types of flights operate without passengers, but positioning flights can carry off-duty crew members being repositioned for duty. Ferry flights, however, are restricted strictly to essential crew only. For a CRJ-200, that means just a captain and a first officer. On this particular day, the captain was 35 years old, with 6,185 total flight hours, nearly 5,000 of them on the CRJ. He wasn't just any pilot. He also served as Saurya's director of operations, responsible for many of the airline's day-to-day functions. Flying alongside him was a much younger, less experienced first officer just 26 years old. The first officer on this flight had logged 1,824 total hours, with roughly 1,600 of those on the CRJ. Colleagues described him as a friendly, positive person who was genuinely passionate about flying. But his career had not been without setbacks. When he traveled to Germany in 2019 for his CRJ type rating, he initially failed his simulator check. That meant 3 extra months of remedial training before he could qualify. The airline made him cover the additional training costs out of his salary, and he was also left paying for his own accommodation and living expenses during that extended stay. He had to take out a loan to cover the debt, and by the time of this flight in 2024, he was still paying it off. Then came the pandemic. Because of his low seniority, he was furloughed without pay during COVID-19. Even after flights resumed, he wasn't given many hours, which cut into his earnings further. Friends later recalled that he felt underpaid and undervalued, but he kept his financial struggles hidden from his parents, adding a personal layer of stress on top of the professional difficulties. Another factor to consider here was the quality of training at Saurya Airlines. The final accident report made it clear that their training program was questionable at best. Investigators noted that some company personnel were so poorly trained that they didn't even know their own airline's policies. The training syllabus itself contained mismatched lists of exercises and durations, raising the suspicion that important lessons were being rushed or skipped outright. Meanwhile, at Tribhuvan Airport, the crew was preparing for what was supposed to be a simple ferry flight. Regulations require only the essential crew, the captain and first officer for such operations. But Saurya Airlines ignored that completely. In reality, a third pilot was added, along with a group of managers and mechanics. The director of continuing airworthiness, the maintenance manager, the safety manager, and the quality assurance manager were all on board. One staff member even brought along his wife and young child. Altogether, there were 19 people aboard 17 extra, none of them supposed to be there. Because this wasn't an official passenger flight, no flight attendants were assigned, and no safety briefing was given. The report never explains why so many people were allowed to tag along. But one possibility is that the mechanics were needed in Pokhara for the scheduled heavy maintenance check, and it was cheaper to fly them there on the aircraft itself than to buy them commercial tickets. But the violations didn't stop with unauthorized passengers. At the same time, engineers began loading maintenance equipment onto the jet. Normally, ground staff trained for cargo handling would take care of that. Here, the mechanics did it themselves, even though they weren't qualified. The cargo holds were filled to capacity, and when there was no space left, items were placed directly into the passenger cabin. Toolboxes, food supplies, and wheel chocks were laid across seats. Worse still, flammable materials, including containers of lubricants, hydraulic fluid, cleaning agents, and engine oil were brought on board. None of it was properly secured. To make matters worse, Saurya Airlines wasn't even certified to carry hazardous materials at all. The most troubling part is that the pilots were fully aware of what was happening. The captain, who also served as the airline's director of operations, was directly responsible for safety standards. His silence suggested that these violations weren't unusual but rather part of the company's routine. This paints a picture of a safety culture where corners were constantly cut and where employees assumed there would be no consequences. Such a mindset can only exist in a regulatory environment where either no one is paying attention or those who are simply don't care. Given what the report revealed about staffing levels at the Civil Aviation Authority of Nepal, the likely answer is that nobody was watching at all. As the aircraft was powered up, the cockpit voice recorder began capturing the activity. At that moment, the first officer was alone in the cockpit, working out the takeoff performance figures. This is where we need to pause and explain what those numbers called VSPs actually are, because they would soon play a critical role in the events that followed. The first of these speeds is V1, also known as the decision speed. Up until V1, a pilot can safely abort the takeoff if something goes wrong. Once past it, however, the aircraft is committed to leaving the ground. In this story, V1 isn't the most important number. The second speed, VR, or rotation speed, is when the pilot begins pulling back on the control column to lift the nose and start climbing. Finally, V2 is the takeoff safety speed, the minimum speed that must be reached by 35 feet of altitude to guarantee a safe climb. Even if one engine fails after V1, these speeds aren't fixed. They change for every single takeoff, depending on the aircraft's weight, outside temperature, runway length, elevation, and other conditions. In large, well-resourced airlines, dispatchers often calculate these figures in advance using performance software and then provide them to the crew, who double-check them. But at smaller operators, including Saurya Airlines, pilots often still had to calculate them manually. This was done with laminated reference cards or pages from the performance manual. Pilots would select the card that matched their planned takeoff weight and flap setting, then apply corrections for temperature and field elevation. Although these cards are based on manufacturer data, they're usually compiled by the airline itself. And in this case, that detail became very significant. For this flight, the first officer needed to know the aircraft's weight, but because no passengers officially checked in, and luggage wasn't properly weighed, a rough estimate had to be used. Dispatchers added about 600 kilograms for the unweighed passengers and baggage. Combined with the known cargo load, crew, fuel, and the jet's empty weight, the total was estimated at 18,137 kilograms. Since the cards were printed in 500 kilo increments, the first officer rounded up, selecting the 18,500 kilogram chart with flaps set at 20. Investigators later reconstructed the aircraft's true weight and found it was about 18,300 kilograms, give or take 200. In other words, the estimate and the choice of card were essentially correct. So what was the problem? The cards themselves. When Saurya Airlines created its set of VSP tables back in 2014, someone had mistakenly copied the values for 17,500 kilograms into the 18,500 kilograms slot without updating the numbers. That meant every VSP for 18,500 kilograms was several knots too slow, and because heavier aircraft need more speed to safely take off, this error introduced a hidden danger into the operation. Unbelievably, this mistake went unnoticed for nearly a decade. The report didn't explain exactly why, but it highlighted the lack of internal quality control and oversight within the airline. To be fair, it would have been difficult for an individual pilot to spot this. Crews don't normally cross-check one card against another, and the 18,500 kilogram weight range was well below the CRJ's maximum, meaning it wasn't used as often. A junior first officer, especially, would have had little reason to question whether the numbers printed on an official airline-issued chart were wrong. The speed at which a pilot begins to lift the nose of the aircraft, called rotation speed, is not the only factor that matters. Just as important is how quickly the pilot rotates. On nearly all commercial jets, pilots are trained to rotate at a steady rate of about 3 degrees per second, continuing smoothly until reaching a takeoff pitch of around 15 to 18 degrees. If this rate is much faster or slower, the risks increase. In a past case I covered involving Aerosuker Flight 157, I explained the dangers of rotating too slowly. Here, though, the focus is on the opposite issue, rotating too quickly, which can be even more dangerous. When a pilot pulls back on the control column, the plane does not immediately lift off. Instead, a sequence of reactions takes place. First, the elevators deflect upward, creating aerodynamic force. This force pivots the aircraft around its center of gravity, raising the nose. As the nose rises, the angle of attack increases, which generates more lift and eventually allows the aircraft to climb. The key point is that these steps don't happen instantly. The flight path responds last. During a normal rotation, the angle of attack rises gradually and remains within safe limits, because the climb begins before the pitch angle gets too high. But if the nose is pulled up too fast, the angle of attack can momentarily surge past safe levels before the aircraft starts climbing. In extreme cases, this can exceed the critical angle of attack and cause a stall, even if the correct airspeed and pitch are reached. This is why rotation technique is practiced heavily in training. New pilots often find it challenging at first, but with enough practice, achieving that 3 degrees per second rhythm becomes instinctive. The system works well after all. Hundreds of millions of takeoffs occur safely every year, without stalls during rotation. Unfortunately, Saurya Airlines became an exception. Investigators reviewing flight data from the airline S2 CRJ aircraft over a 16-month period found frequent cases of pilots rotating too quickly. In some instances, the peak rotation rate went beyond 5 degrees per second, which is considered extremely high. Two of the worst examples happened in early 2024 on the same aircraft later involved in the accident. On January 11th and March 19th, where rotation rates of 5.8 and 5.5 degrees per second were recorded. One of these flights was even piloted by the same captain who would later fly the accident ferry flight to Pokhara. The troubling part was that this wasn't a single pilot issue. It was widespread among the airline's crews. The official report didn't explain how this practice developed, but there are possible reasons. New pilots often over-rotate at first, and it's difficult to perfect the feel for this maneuver in a simulator. It usually takes repeated practice in the actual aircraft, with direct instructor feedback. If Saurya Airlines had limited training resources and a small fleet, their crews may not have received the oversight needed to build consistent technique. Another factor could have been the aircraft's loading characteristics. The CRJ has a center of lift located fairly far back. When heavily loaded, the center of gravity tends to shift forward. In such cases, stronger back pressure on the controls may be needed to raise the nose. If pilots became accustomed to this aggressive input during full flights, they might unintentionally use the same technique during lighter flights, resulting in overly rapid rotations. What makes this worse is that the airline's own flight manual clearly warned about the risk of stalls during over-rotation. Still, the safety department didn't catch the trend. According to investigators, this was because the airline lacked an effective safety management system. While policies existed on paper, in practice there was no proper chain of responsibility, no reliable way to report hazards, and no program for monitoring flight data. Although the airline had bought a flight data monitoring system, it was never actually put to use. And without a way to catch this issue, it was only a matter of time before one of Saurya Airlines pilots would pull back too aggressively at the wrong moment. That moment came during this flight. As the thrust levers were advanced to takeoff power, the engines roared and the CRJ began its run down the runway. The captain, as agreed, was flying the aircraft while the first officer monitored the instruments. At 114 knots, the first officer called V1, followed seconds later by rotate at 118 knots. At 120 knots, the captain pulled sharply on the control column to lift the nose. Because the aircraft was relatively light that day, this sudden pull resulted in the most extreme rotation ever captured in the airline's flight data. In the span of a single second, the elevators deflected from 1.5 to 10 degrees nose-up, producing a nose-up pitch rate of 6.5 degrees per second, more than double the recommended rate. The nose passed 12 degrees in just 2 seconds. But since rotation began slightly below the proper speed, the angle of attack required for liftoff was already higher than normal. This meant the aircraft's flight path lagged behind, and the angle of attack spiked quickly above 10 degrees. Even though the captain stopped pulling after 1 second, the angle of attack had already climbed dangerously close to stall conditions. On this particular aircraft, the right wing consistently carried a slightly higher angle of attack than the left. As a result, the right wing reached the stall point first, triggering the stick shaker on the captain's side. 1 second later, the warning also activated on the left. At this stage, the airplane was only a few feet above the ground. In a stall situation, the correct action is to add maximum thrust and lower the nose to reduce angle of attack. But that response never came. The report does not state why, but given how sudden and low this stall was, the captain may not have had time to react. The first officer did recognize the over-rotation and shouted, "Whoa, whoa, whoa, sir." But his startled reaction, while understandable, didn't provide the clear instructions the captain needed, such as pitch down or add power. As the CRJ lifted off, the right wing began stalling, rolling the aircraft sharply right to about 25 degrees of bank. The captain countered with a strong left input, just as the left wing also began to stall, causing a rapid swing leftward to 55 degrees of bank, before reversing again. The stick shaker rattled continuously, and the ground proximity system began issuing warnings likely, including bank angle. Despite the warnings, the aircraft managed to climb to roughly 100 feet, but then, while rolling right again, the stall deepened. The CRJ-200 is equipped with a stick pusher system designed to automatically push the nose down in a stall to help recovery and prevent the dangerous deep stall condition that T-tailed jets can experience. However, this safeguard only works if the aircraft has enough height. At barely 100 feet, it was too late. At the peak of its short climb, the plane rolled into a bank of over 94 degrees, nearly on its side, and fully stalled. The stick pusher engaged, but the captain pulled back hard on the controls, overriding it in a desperate attempt to avoid crashing. At that altitude, though, the controls could no longer save the jet. Just 13 seconds after liftoff, the aircraft struck the ground. It hit in a 30-degree right bank with a slight nose-up attitude. The right wingtip slammed into the taxiway, rupturing the fuel tank and triggering an explosion. The jet then skidded across the grass in a partially inverted position before crashing into a shipping container, a storage shed, and finally a helicopter belonging to Air Dynasty. The obstacles that the aircraft struck were positioned inside the 140-meter runway safety zone that the International Civil Aviation Organization recommends airports maintain clear margins. Unfortunately, those standards weren't being followed at this airfield. When the jet collided with these objects, the cockpit smashed into a shipping container. The impact separated the flight deck from the rest of the fuselage and sent it plunging into a ravine. Meanwhile, the burning cabin and wings carried forward, sliding into a nearby construction site about 21 meters below runway level. The force of this crash caused catastrophic injuries to everyone in the passenger cabin, and even if anyone survived the initial impact, the fire that quickly consumed the wreckage left no chance of escape. Fuel spilling from the ruptured wings ignited and fed a blaze that swept through the damaged cabin. Once the flames entered, they were likely intensified by flammable cargo scattered across the seats and aisles. None of the 16 people in the passenger cabin survived. In the cockpit, the container absorbed part of the impact, and there was less fire in that section, making survival conditions slightly better. For the 2 pilots and an additional crew member, everything now depended on how quickly help could arrive. But the rescue was hampered by several factors. The steep terrain that didn't meet ICAO standards, the blocked access routes due to construction debris, and the airport's limited firefighting organization. Fire trucks could not get close to the wreckage. One truck sprayed water from the top of the slope, but there was no coordinated response, and neither foam nor fire-suppressing chemicals were applied, because the airport's emergency plan didn't even cover this part of the field. The first people to reach the cockpit were ground staff who had run toward the wreck after seeing the explosion. They managed to pull the captain out and help him up the slope to emergency responders, who rushed him to the hospital with serious injuries. Moments later, flames engulfed the rest of the cockpit, and no one else inside was recovered alive. In the end, 18 people were killed. The captain was the sole survivor. Investigators determined that the direct cause of the crash was the captain's rapid nose-up rotation at too low a speed, which led to an aerodynamic stall immediately after liftoff. Several contributing factors were identified: the incorrect VSP card, the airline's failure to monitor and address overly aggressive rotations, poor planning and execution of the ferry flight, and unsafe cargo loading practices. Although the unsecured cargo did not shift during takeoff, the disorganized loading was still cited as a symptom of deeper safety management failures. The root problem was almost total lack of oversight. Proper safety oversight requires trained inspectors, internal audits, thorough staff training, accountability for violations, and a functioning safety management system. Without these layers in place, risks go unnoticed until disaster occurs. After the crash, Saurya Airlines suspended operations. The company had only one airworthy aircraft left, and the accident killed several of its key managers, including those responsible for safety, maintenance, and quality control. In total, 4 of the airline's 10 management staff were lost in the crash. Despite this, the airline has since sought to regain certification to fly again. The Nepalese aviation regulator revoked the company's operating certificate after the accident. Whether or not it will be reinstated remains to be seen. What is clear is that without sweeping changes, the same unsafe conditions could return. It's also worth noting that all Nepalese carriers remain on the European Union's aviation blacklist, meaning they are banned from operating in European airspace. For travelers in Nepal, though, choices are limited. That's why it's critical that authorities take the findings of this report seriously, implement meaningful reforms, and strengthen safety oversight. Only then can confidence in the system be restored and tragedies like this be prevented.